The morning sun, already a brutal fist, beat down on the construction site, baking the raw earth to a fine, choking powder. Dust, thick and red, hung in the air, clinging to my clothes, coating my tongue with a gritty film. I squinted, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of a gloved hand, the roar of the excavators, a familiar, relentless symphony in my ears. Another day. Another battle against the clerk and the elements. "Hold that line, 53. I bellowed into my calms, my voice a strained rasp over the din. "Just another 3 feet. Steady." The massive arm of the excavator paused, hydraulic fluid groaning in protest, then eased its bucket down precisely where I needed it. Precision. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. Here, amidst the chaos of steel and concrete, I could impose order. I could see the plan, the blueprint, and make it happen. Not like everything else since I'd come home. The blank stares, the polite but confused nods when I tried to explain what I'd done, what I'd seen. Civilian life was a different kind of trench, and I was still digging. I took a slow breath, the air thick with diesel fumes and the damp, metallic tang of disturbed earth. The new foundation for the north wing was finally taking shape, a sprawling grid of rebar and freshly poured concrete. My responsibility. Every beam, every bolt, every cubic yard of dirt moved. It was a heavy weight, but a tangible one, better than the invisible ones I carried. My checklist was a crumpled map in my hand, ticking off completed tasks with a stubby pencil. The final run of inspections for the day. I needed to check the drainage lines in the newly excavated trench near the old warehouse perimeter, a forgotten corner of the site, mostly untouched until now. The ground there had been soft, unstable, despite the engineer's assurances. My gut had been twisting about it for days. The noise of the main site faded as I moved away, the roar of machinery replaced by the crunch of my boots on loose gravel and the distant, rhythmic thump of a pile driver. The air grew cooler here, trapped between the towering, rusting shell of the old warehouse and a newly formed earthen berm. Shadows consumed the edges of my vision, deep and long, despite the midday sun. I reached the trench, a raw, jagged gash in the earth, about 10 feet deep and maybe 20 wide. A fresh rain from the night before had left the walls slick, smelling of wet clay and something else, something stagnant. I leaned over the edge, scanning the uneven floor of the trench. The drainage pipes were visible, mostly intact. Good. But then my gaze snagged on something out of place. A patch of darker earth near the far wall, disturbed, as if someone had tried to rake it smooth, but poorly. My skin prickled, aware. The ground was spongy underfoot, still holding moisture. I walked towards the disturbed patch, my eyes narrowing. A faint, sweet odor, cloying and sickly, reached me, cutting through the damp earth smell. It was familiar, too familiar. The metallic fear coated my tongue. Then I saw it. A boot. Not a work boot, not one of ours. A dress shoe, scuffed and muddy, but unmistakably a dress shoe. It protruded from the loose dirt at an unnatural angle, the toe pointing straight up. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I knelt, pushing at the loose soil with my gloved hand. My breath caught. No, this wasn't right. This wasn't an accident. Accidents on a site like this were messy. They left equipment mangled, concrete shattered. This was too quiet, too neat despite the shallow burial. I dug faster, fear coiling in my stomach, turning the nausea through me. The soil was loose, almost as if it had been deliberately backfilled, not naturally eroded. A hand emerged, palm up, fingers curled. The skin was pale, waxy, already starting to tell a story of too long in the damp earth. My mind raced, cataloging instinctively. No ring, clean fingernails. The cuff of the shirt was white, pristine beneath the mud. I stood abruptly, backing away, the cloying scent suddenly overwhelming. A man, partially buried, dead. My comms unit felt like a stone in my hand. I thumbed the button, my voice rough. "This is Jamal. Emergency. I need an ambulance and the police. North Trench, old warehouse perimeter. I've found a body." The words felt alien heavy. The first officer to arrive, a young patrolman whose uniform looked too stiff, slid down into the trench, his flashlight beam dancing nervously. He muttered something about unstable ground, a tragic fall. His eyes scanned the muddy walls, looking for signs of a slip, a tumble. He didn't look at the body, not really. Not the way I was looking. Then the detective arrived, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense stride. She took one look at the scene, then at me. "Supervisor, is it? Jamal?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I nodded. "Tell me what happened." I recounted my inspection, the disturbed earth, the discovery. She listened, her gaze flicking from the body to the trench walls, then back to me. "Looks like a fall, maybe." My training screamed otherwise. The way the body lay, almost posed, the lack of any significant external trauma, at least visible on what I could see. The pristine shirt cuff, and the dirt itself. It wasn't natural displacement. It was placed. And that strange, sickly, sweet smell, growing stronger now that the sun was higher. It wasn't just decay. My mind, for a brief, disorienting moment, drifted to the strange package that had arrived at my apartment last week. A bill, really. From a feed store, supplies ordered in my name. You're not farming. It made no sense. A tiny, nagging anomaly in the periphery of my life, now overshadowed by this. But the thought, a thread of something out of place, lingered. The detective was still talking, directing the patrolman, her voice a low murmur. "We'll get the forensics unit out here, process the scene. This trench will be closed indefinitely." I watched her, a knot tightening in my stomach. A fall, a tragic accident. That was the easy answer, the civilian answer. But the ice that flooded my veins wasn't from the cool air in the trench. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate act. And something told me, deep in my gut, that no one was going to want to believe it. The cold certainty from the trench hadn't thawed. It solidified into a hard knot in my gut as the first responders swarmed the site. Sirens wailed, a high-pitched, frantic sound that scraped against the raw edges of my nerves. Flashing blue and red lights painted the dust-choked air in chaotic streaks, turning the familiar construction zone into something alien and terrifying. The smell of fresh earth, usually a comforting scent of progress, now mingled with the acrid tang of exhaust fumes and something vaguely metallic, like old pennies. A detective, a man carved from granite and weariness, pushed through the cluster of uniformed officers. He was introduced as Detective Miller. His suit was rumpled, his tie askew, and his eyes held the distant flicker of too many late nights. He smelled faintly of stale coffee and something metallic, like old keys, a scent I remembered from the few times I'd had to deal with official inquiries back in the service. He took one look at the trench, then at me, his gaze lingering, assessing. "Supervisor Jamal." His voice was gravelly low. "That's me, detective." My own voice felt thin, alien in the sudden cacophony. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Walk me through it. Everything I saw, from the moment I arrived this morning." I recounted the morning, the walk through, the chill in the air, the glint of something unnatural in the freshly dug earth. I told him about the body, face down, limbs splayed, but not quite, naturally. I described the way her hair fanned out, almost too perfectly, across the packed soil. There wasn't much loose earth around her, not like she'd just fallen from a height and dislodged a pile of it, like something had been dragged, not fallen. Detective Miller scribbled in a small notebook, his pen scratching a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant sirens. He looked up, his gaze sharp. "Site hazards, supervisor. Open trenches, heavy machinery. Accidents happen. It's a tragedy, but we see it all the time." His words were calm, almost rehearsed, but I felt the dismissal in them. He wanted the easy answer, the civilian answer. "Yes, sir," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "But the marks, and the lack of displacement, it just didn't quite fit." I watched his face for a flicker of recognition, a sign that he heard the nuance, but his expression remained a mask of professional weariness. He was already leaning towards the tragic accident, a conclusion neatly packaged and ready for filing. I knew what I saw, and it wasn't adding up. The rest of my statement was a blur of questions about safety protocols, shift changes, and who had access to the site. I answered them mechanically, my mind still replaying the image of the body, the unnatural stillness of it. The official investigation unfolded around me like a well-oiled machine. Forensics technicians, moving with grim efficiency, set up their grid, their cameras flashing, capturing every detail of the grim scene. The air thickened with the chemical scent of disinfectant and something else, a faint, metallic tang that made the back of my throat prickle. Once I was released from further questioning, I found myself drifting. I couldn't just stand there, doing nothing, watching them miss what I believed was right in front of them. My feet carried me towards the temporary office trailer, a cramped box of plywood and aluminum, usually bustling with activity. Today, it was quiet, an island of stillness in the chaos. A stack of delivery manifests was clipped to a board just inside the door, awaiting my signature for incoming materials. Habit, a hardwired instinct from my military days, made me scan them. My name, Jamal, was clear as day at the top of the newest manifest, but the order below it made my stomach clench. 50 bags premium chicken feed, 20 pounds organic scratch. My eyes reread the line. Then again. My name, my site, chicken feed. I wasn't farming. Nobody on this construction site was farming. We were building a new commercial complex, not a barn. The air tasted suddenly of dust and a bitter, unidentifiable fear. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a deliberate misdirection, a flag planted in the middle of my professional life. I pulled the manifest from the clip, the paper feeling rough and alien in my hand. The delivery date was 2 days ago. I hadn't signed for it. I hadn't even seen it. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots between a dead woman in a trench and a phantom order for poultry supplies. It was absurd. The detective might be content with an accident, but this was no accident of logistics. This was a lie, and I was going to find out why it had my name on it. The line about chicken feed still burned behind my eyes. I'd stared at that requisition form for so long the ink felt like it was leaching into my brain. My name, my site, chicken feed. The air still tasted of dust and a bitter, unidentifiable fear clinging to my tongue. This whole thing was a bad joke. A bureaucratic glitch had to be. But the form was real, printed, signed my signature, or a damn good forgery. I pushed back from my desk, the plastic chair groaning a protest under my weight. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a dull, insistent drum. I needed to see it, touch it, make it real or make it vanish. The feed store. I pulled up the address on my phone, the screen a cold blue rectangle in the dim office light. My stomach twisted with nausea. This wasn't just about a body anymore. This was about me. The feed store smelled like burlap, dry grain, and something vaguely metallic, like old farm equipment. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on towering stacks of sacks. I felt out of place, a square peg in a round hole, surrounded by shovels and horse tack. A woman with a faded denim apron and a tight bun of grey hair behind the counter looked up as I approached, his gaze sharp. "Can I help, mister?" he asked, his voice raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I think so," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm Jamal Harris. I'm here about an order placed under my name." I laid the crumpled requisition form on the counter. She squinted at it, then at me, then back at the form. "Harris? Yes, I remember this one," she said, tapping a long, manicured nail on the page. "Quite the order. 10 tons of poultry feed, high-protein mix, and a dozen bags of lime. Picked up 2 days ago. Said I needed it for a new project, experimental farming." Her lips thinned into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Never seen a farmer in a hard hat before, but who am I to judge? 10 tons. My blood ran cold. I wasn't farming. Nobody on my construction site was farming. Experimental farming. I managed, the words catching in my throat. "Who picked it up?" "Big fellow," she answered, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Had a company truck, logo painted on the side. Said he was my foreman. Paid cash. Said I was in a hurry to get the new livestock settled." She shrugged. Sounded a bit odd, but the cash was green. A company truck. Not mine, not any of my crew's. The description was vague, but the detail about new livestock and the cash payment felt like a deliberate misdirection, a cover story. My mind raced. This was a setup, but for what? And why my name? The metallic fear coated my tongue, sharper now, more defined. Later that afternoon, a call from the detective pulled me from the deepening spiral of my thoughts. "Jamal." The detective's voice was flat, devoid of its usual clipped efficiency. "Can I come down to the station? We have the preliminary autopsy report." The station felt like a concrete bunker, smelling of stale coffee and something vaguely antiseptic. The detective sat across from me, his face etched with a grim weariness that hadn't been there yesterday. He pushed a folder across the table, not quite meeting my gaze. "The initial assessment," he began, his voice low, "indicates some inconsistencies with a simple fall. Our victim, we've identified him as a junior engineer named Marcus Thorne from Sterling Construction, my rival firm." My mind reeled. Sterling Construction. They'd been bidding against us for the city contract. A junior engineer. This wasn't just a body on my site anymore. This was a rival dead on my site. Corporate sabotage. That felt too clean, too simple. Thorne sustained a number of injuries. The detective continued, flipping open the folder. Beyond the trauma from the fall itself, there are deep contusions on his forearms, consistent with defensive wounds, and a fracture to the occipital bone that appears to have occurred before the fall, likely from a blunt force impact. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Meaning, Jamal, he was likely struck, then pushed, or thrown. Ice flooded my veins. Not an accident, not even a simple push. This was deliberate. "So, foul play," I stated, the words tasting like ash. "Definitely foul play," he confirmed, his eyes finally locking with mine. "And the time of death is estimated to be late Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning. Hours before my crew arrived, or they wanted to make it look like an accident on your site." The implications hit me like a physical blow. The chicken feed. Someone was trying to frame me, or at least implicate me in a murder. The air pressed like cotton in my ears, making his next words distant, muffled. The site, which I'd built from the ground up, now felt alien, corrupted. I knew the detective would secure the area, but I had to go back to the pit just one more time. My gut screamed at me. Something was missed. The security fence was already up, yellow tape fluttering like tattered flags in the evening breeze. I found a gap, ducking under it, the coarse plastic scraping against my jacket. The air was cooler down in the pit, thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh concrete. My flashlight beam cut through the encroaching gloom, dancing over disturbed soil and discarded rebar. The official forensic team had been thorough, but my military training, honed by years of sifting through rubble for hidden threats, told me sometimes the smallest things spoke the loudest. I moved slowly, methodically, near the edge where Thorne's body had been found, my eyes scanning every inch of the ground. My boot crunched on something small, something that wasn't gravel or concrete dust. I knelt, pushing aside a loose chunk of broken asphalt. There, nestled against a jagged shard of rock, was a tiny, iridescent fragment. It was no bigger than my thumbnail, a sliver of something that caught the last dying light of the sun, reflecting a deep, unnatural blue. It wasn't plastic, not glass, not metal. It had a strange, almost organic sheen, like a beetle's wing, but too angular, too perfect. I carefully picked it up, feeling its smooth, cool surface between my thumb and forefinger. It looked like a piece of polished stone, but the color, I'd never seen anything like it. And it certainly didn't belong on a construction site. This was something specific, something foreign, and it felt like the first real piece of the puzzle. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows as I walked away from the station, the knot of cold dread in my gut tightening with every step. Chicken feed. The phrase echoed, absurd and terrifying. I wasn't farming. I didn't even own a pet larger than a goldfish, and those things ate flakes, not pellets. The implication was clear. Someone wasn't just trying to pin the murder on me. They were trying to make it look like I was involved in something rural, something with a motive I couldn't even begin to fathom. My mind spun, trying to reconcile the image of a construction site with a feed store, supplies ordered in your name. You're not farming. It was a deliberate, clumsy frame-up, designed to muddy the waters, to make me look suspicious. The metallic fear coated my tongue, a bitter aftertaste to the day. The next morning, the construction site felt different. The usual cacophony of drills and heavy machinery was muted, replaced by a low hum of uneasy chatter. Even the air seemed heavier, thick with unspoken questions. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, slicing through gaps in the half-finished walls, illuminating the lingering tension. My boots crunched on loose gravel as I headed directly for the site office. The manager and an executive were waiting, their faces stern, hands clasped on the polished surface of the temporary desk. The air conditioning hummed, too loud in the quiet room, carrying the faint, sterile scent of new laminate and cheap coffee. "Jamal," the manager began, his voice flat, devoid of its usual booming authority. "We need to talk about the disruption." The executive, a man whose tailored suit always seemed out of place on a construction site, leaned forward. "This investigation is costing us. Delays, bad press, and my involvement is raising eyebrows." He paused, letting the words hang, heavy and accusatory. "We understand I found the body, Jamal, but my continued meddling, as the detective put it, isn't helping. Some might even say it's making things worse." My pulse hammered against my ribs. "I'm not meddling. I'm trying to understand what happened on my site, and I'm cooperating with the investigation." I kept my voice level, but the heat of indignation rose in my chest. They weren't concerned about justice. They were concerned about their bottom line, and I was a convenient scapegoat. The manager's gaze was cold, assessing. "Just focus on my job, Jamal. Let the professionals handle it. We don't want any more." I left the office with a renewed sense of resolve, but also a prickle of paranoia. They were watching me. I spent the rest of the morning moving through the site, a ghost among the still operating crews. My hands, usually busy directing, now moved with a different purpose. I checked the blueprints in my head against the physical reality. I ran my fingers along recently poured concrete, feeling for inconsistencies in the texture. The familiar smell of wet cement and fresh-cut lumber was usually comforting, but today it only amplified my unease. The victim had been found near a newly erected utility shaft meant for future electrical conduits. It was a tight space, barely wide enough for a worker, let alone a body to be accidentally fall into. I ducked inside, the air suddenly cooler, carrying the damp scent of earth and metal. My eyes scanned every rivet, every joint. I saw nothing obvious. No loose panels, no freshly patched holes. My skin prickled, aware of the quiet. Was I imagining things? There was the pressure getting to me. Then, near the bottom, where the shaft met the foundation slab, my fingers brushed against something. A slight irregularity. Not a crack, but a seam almost perfectly disguised. A section of the concrete, no larger than my hand, felt subtly different, slightly less rough than the surrounding surface. It was a perfect patch, almost invisible to the casual eye, but my experienced touch registered the minute shift. I pressed harder. It didn't budge. It was there. Someone had been covering something up. The implications of this small, almost imperceptible detail sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just about a body. It was about what that body was found near. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was the detective. "Jamal, I think you'll want to hear this." His voice was tight, urgent. We agreed to meet at a diner on the edge of town, a place where the scent of stale coffee and frying grease hung heavy in the air. He slid into the booth opposite me, his face etched with fatigue. He didn't order anything, just pushed a lukewarm cup of coffee towards me. "Our victim," he began. He was a quiet guy, kept to himself. But he was good at his job. Too good, maybe. He took a slow breath. Turns out he was working on a highly secretive project for his company, something proprietary. Patent-pending stuff, high-tech construction materials. Billions potentially at stake. His company is furious, not just about the murder, but about the possibility of their research being compromised. My mind raced. Secretive project, high-tech materials, and a perfectly disguised patch in a utility shaft. "So you think someone killed him to get access to his work?" I inquired, the words feeling heavy. Maybe he found something. Maybe he was something. A mole, even. The detective ran a hand over his face. "This isn't just a construction accident, Jamal. And it's not just a random killing. This goes deeper. And about that feed store, we're still looking into who placed that order. It's a dead end so far, but it's a hell of a misdirection, isn't it?" He watched me, his gaze sharp, assessing my reaction. My mind raced. Secretive project, and a perfectly disguised patch in a utility shaft. "So I think someone killed him to get access to his work?" I questioned, the words feeling heavy. The detective nodded slowly. "Or to silence him. A mole, Ev." He trailed off, leaving me with the unsettling silence of a half-formed thought. I hung up, the phone cool against my ear, its plastic shell feeling too thin for the weight of the conversation. The construction site, usually a symphony of controlled chaos, now felt like a stage set. Every beam, every slab of concrete, every stacked pallet of drywall seemed to hold a secret. The air, typically thick with dust, and the scent of fresh lumber, now carried a faint, metallic tang that tasted like suspicion. I had to look. I had to see for myself. My boots crunched over loose gravel as I headed back to the utility shaft, the one where the victim had been found. I pulled on a pair of work gloves, the coarse fabric of familiar comfort, and started prodding at the edges of the patched section. My fingers, calloused from years of labor, searched for any give, any seam that didn't quite belong. The patch itself was flawless, a professional job, but I wasn't looking for sloppy work. I was looking for intent. I moved around the shaft, scrutinizing the surrounding structural elements. My eyes traced the lines of the steel beams, the poured concrete. Everything looked standard by the book, but a nagging feeling persisted. The detective's words, high-tech materials, echoed in my head. This building was meant to be a simple office block, not some cutting-edge research facility. I pulled out my site plans, unfolding the large blueprints against a grimy concrete wall. I scanned them, cross-referencing the specifications for the materials, the load-bearing requirements, the exact type of rebar and concrete mix. Then I saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible discrepancy. A particular section of a support column, marked on the plans as standard C30 concrete, felt subtly different to my touch. Denser, I tapped it with a small hammer from my belt. The sound was wrong. Not the dull thud of C30, but a sharper, higher-pitched ring, like striking solid metal, though it looked like concrete. I knelt, running my gloved hand over the surface. Beneath the paint and the superficial finish, I could feel a minute variation in texture, a slight smoothness where there should have been the grainy roughness of aggregate. Someone had replaced a section of a load-bearing column with something else entirely, then meticulously disguised it. Not just a patch, but an insertion. This wasn't about hiding a body, it was about hiding what was hidden inside. This was a deliberate, calculated act of concealment right here on my site. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the detective's contact. This was bigger than a simple murder. This was about the integrity of the building itself and whatever was buried within its structure. Jamal! A voice called out, making me jump. I shoved my phone back into my pocket, turning to see a site supervisor from the rival company, Mr. Henderson, strolling towards me. He wore a crisp, unblemished hard hat, unlike my own dusty, scratched one, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just checking in, things running smoothly. As smoothly as they can, I replied, my voice tighter than I liked. I tried to project an air of nonchalance, but my mind was racing, wondering how much he knew, how much he represented. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the column I'd just been examining. Good. I know this project. It's a big deal for us. A lot riding on it. Reputation, future contracts, all that. He paused, letting his words hang in the dusty air. Wouldn't want anything to jeopardize it. Any unforeseen complications. His eyes, a pale blue, held mine for a beat too long. Especially not from anyone. The distant hum of city traffic seemed to fade. His tone was light, almost conversational, but the underlying message was clear as a siren. This wasn't a warning, it was a threat. He knew I was looking. He knew I was close. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a possessive claim than a friendly pat. His hand lingered, radiating an unnatural warmth through my shirt. Just thought I'd mention it. We're all a team here, right? Best to keep our focus on the job at hand. With another unsettling smile, he turned and walked away, his polished work boots leaving surprisingly faint prints in the gravel. I stood there, the lingering phantom pressure of his hand on my shoulder, the scent of his expensive cologne fading into the concrete dust. Ice flooded my veins. They weren't just covering something up, they were actively protecting it, and they were watching me. I finally called the detective, relaying my discovery about the tampered column, the strange density, the wrong sound. That tracks, the detective said, his voice crackling slightly through the phone. My people have been digging into the rival company's financials. They found a series of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and some very peculiar expenditures. A significant amount of money channeled into research and development for a project that doesn't officially exist, and a lot of payments to a material supplier that folded last year. The victim's name pops up in a few of those transactions, mostly as an external consultant. So he wasn't just working for them, I responded, a new piece clicking into place. He was involved in their black market operations. Looks like it, the detective confirmed. And those high-tech materials he was supposedly developing, they align perfectly with the kind of capital outlay we're seeing. The air tasted bitter. I needed to be careful. My mind drifted to the mundane, a desperate attempt to ground myself. I had to pick up those supplies for the site office. Later that afternoon, I drove my beat-up truck to the usual hardware store, the setting sun casting long, orange streaks across the sky. But as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a small, rustic sign I hadn't registered before: Farm and Feed Supplies. My stomach clenched. I had no reason to be here. I wasn't farming. I needed drywall screws, not chicken feed. I walked inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The air was thick with the earthy scent of grain, hay, and a faint, sweet smell of molasses. Sacks of feed were stacked high against the walls, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light filtering through the grimy windows. Jamal, the proprietor, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, emerged from behind a counter piled with seed packets. Glad Ira here. Had a rather large order come in for I. Been sitting here a couple days. My heart hammered against my ribs. An order for me. I knew, with a sickening certainty, what was coming. Yep, said to be sure it was picked up by I personally. He gestured to a corner where a stack of burlap sacks and a few odd-looking metal components sat. 20 sacks of high-protein livestock feed, some specialized irrigation tubing, and a rather expensive, heavy-duty electric fence charger, all under my name. Said I'd know what it was for. I stared at the pile. Livestock feed, irrigation, electric fence. My name, I wasn't even gardening. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. Someone knew where I lived, what I drove, and was making it clear they could reach into my life, even into the most innocuous corners, to remind me of the consequences of digging too deep. They weren't just watching, they were playing, into the most intimate corners of my life. I stood there, the scent of hay and processed grains thick in the air, the fluorescent lights of the feed store buzzing overhead like trapped flies. My name, Jamal, printed on a receipt for livestock feed, irrigation supplies, electric fence components. I wasn't even gardening, let alone farming. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden cold that sank into my marrow. This was a message. A very specific, very chilling message. Someone knew where I lived, what I drove, and was making it clear they could reach into my life, even into the most intimate corners of my life. The clerk, a young man with a perpetually bored expression, just stared past me, waiting for me to move. I forced myself to fold the receipt, the cheap paper crinkling loudly in the quiet store. My hands felt clumsy, alien. The air tasted metallic like fear. I needed to get out. My truck felt like a target, my apartment a trap. I drove, not home, but aimlessly, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, my mind racing. Who, how, and why this? It wasn't just a threat. It was a violation, a deliberate trespass into my sense of security. I ended up at the construction site, the same place where I'd found the victim. It was late, past midnight. The security guard, a grizzled old-timer, barely looked up from his thermos as I flashed my ID. The site was a skeletal landscape of rebar and concrete, bathed in the anemic glow of temporary work lights. Wind whistled through the unfinished structures, a lonely, mournful sound. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but the thought of going home, of waiting for whatever came next, was unbearable. I needed to do something. My boots crunched on gravel as I walked towards the foundation pit where the body had been discovered. The area was still cordoned off, but I ducked under the tape. The ground was churned earth, still damp in places. I pulled out my phone, using its flashlight to sweep the area, remembering the exact spot. The official investigators had been thorough, but they were looking for a crime scene. I was looking for a secret. I knelt, running my gloved fingers over the rough concrete edges of the pit, then the surrounding dirt. The air here smelled of damp earth, and something acrid, like burnt plastic, a smell that had lingered since the first day. It wasn't a typical construction smell. My light caught on a faint impression in the packed earth, partially obscured by a stray piece of rebar. It wasn't a footprint. It was a series of small, shallow indentations, almost like teeth marks, but too uniform. I leaned closer, brushing away loose soil. The pattern was distinct, almost like a serial number pressed into the ground. A specific tool, not a shovel, not a pickaxe. Something designed for precision, for digging, but with a unique, ridged edge. I pulled out a small notepad and sketched the pattern, memorizing the dimensions. It wasn't standard. I'd never seen anything like it on any of my sites. It looked almost like a specialized digging head, perhaps for a miniature excavator, but one with a very particular, almost industrial purpose. This wasn't about laying foundations for an office building. This was something else entirely. The weight that doesn't add up moment hit me with the force of a physical blow. My mind went back to the victim. The way he'd been so secretive, the hushed phone calls, the late nights. He'd been working on something down here, something he didn't want anyone to see. This tool mark, this specific pattern, it had to be related to his secret project. And if it was, then this project was far more specialized, far more covert than anyone had let on. I thought about the strange, reinforced sections of the foundation we'd been pouring, the unusual depth in certain areas that had seemed excessive for a standard building. We were building something stronger than necessary, something designed to withstand. What? My mind flashed back to my military days, to hardened bunkers and specialized communication arrays. The materials, the unusual specifications, it all clicked into place with a sickening thud. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. This was a cover-up involving technology, perhaps even military-grade tech, being repurposed or hidden. This could be a black site, a clandestine operation disguised as civilian construction. And if it was, it had direct implications for my past, for the kind of operations I'd been involved in. I stood, my gaze sweeping over the silent, unfinished structures. The scale of it, the audacity. My company, my project, used as a front for something so profoundly wrong. Nausea twisted through me. How deep did this go? As I turned to leave, my foot scuffed against something small and hard, partially buried. I bent down, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. It must have been dislodged, perhaps missed by the initial sweep. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal in my gloved hand. It was old, worn, smooth in places. I thumbed the clasp open. Inside, 2 faded photographs. On the left, the victim, younger, smiling, his arm around a woman. On the right, the woman alone, her smile bright, her eyes crinkling at the corners. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that woman. I knew her well. It was the colleague, the one who worked in the planning office, the one who always had a kind word, a gentle smile, the one who had seemed so genuinely distressed by the victim's death. My hand trembled, the locket almost slipping from my grasp. This wasn't just a construction worker. This wasn't just a victim. He was connected, directly connected to someone I saw every day, someone I had trusted. The air suddenly felt too thin, too heavy. The world tilted on its axis. The betrayal was a bitter taste on my tongue. My name, Jamal. The paper, thin and thermal, felt flimsy in my grip, but the weight of what it represented pressed down on me like a physical force, on something I hadn't bought, for a purpose I couldn't fathom, not for myself anyway. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, replacing the initial shock. This wasn't just a simple mix-up. This was deliberate. Someone had used my identity, not just to purchase these bizarre items, but to tie me to them. The question was, why? And how did it connect to the body on my site? The pieces were beginning to click, ugly and sharp. This wasn't about a missing person or a simple accident anymore. This was a calculated web, and I was caught in the middle of it. The air in the feed store, usually comforting in its earthy smell, now felt stale, cloying. I folded the receipt carefully, tucking it into my pocket as if it were a fragile balm. I drove straight to the detective's office. The journey felt short, my mind racing, pulling together every stray detail, every uneasy feeling I'd had since discovering the victim. The antiseptic scent of the office building's hallway did little to calm my churning stomach. I found the detective at her desk, a stack of files dwarfing her monitor. She looked up, her expression a mix of weary patience and polite skepticism. "Jamal," he said, his voice flat. "Another lead." "More than a lead," I replied, pulling out the receipt. I laid it on her desk beside a half-eaten sandwich. "This is from the feed store. Irrigation supplies, electric fence components, livestock feed, all bought in my name." She picked up the receipt, her brow furrowing as she scanned it. "You're farming now." Her tone held a hint of amusement, which grated on my already frayed nerves. "No, I'm not. That's the point. Someone bought these, used my identity, and I think I know why." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Remember the unusual soil composition reports? The ones the corporate executive tried to bury, and the land acquisition for the new park project. It's all connected." I took a deep breath, marshalling my thoughts. The victim, they found something big, not just a body, but proof of what was happening on that land before we even broke ground. The corporate executive, they've been cutting corners, dumping illegal waste, probably trying to get away with using substandard materials for the entire park construction. The irrigation supplies and electric fence components could be for a makeshift containment system or to deter people from a specific area. The livestock feed, maybe to attract animals, to make it look like a natural habitat, to cover up the contaminated land, to make it look like a pristine nature preserve, when really it's a toxic dump. The detective's expression shifted, the amusement draining from her face, replaced by a thoughtful frown. She tapped the receipt against her desk. "Your name on these supplies. For a project you're supervising, it makes you look involved." "Exactly," I said, a bitter taste coating my tongue. "It's a frame or a distraction. They're trying to point the finger at me to make it look like I was the one trying to hide something or that I was involved in whatever the victim found." My pulse hammered against my ribs, a drumbeat of urgency. But the victim, they must have stumbled onto the dumping. They tried to expose it and they were silenced. Either an accident that was covered up or something far worse. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the low hum of her computer. Then she looked up, her eyes meeting mine, a spark of understanding finally igniting in their depths. The soil samples were indeed odd. The corporate executive was very aggressive about having them refiled. A clerical error that doesn't add up to electric fences and livestock feed. The wait that doesn't add up moment had arrived. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. No, it doesn't. And I think the corporate executive knows exactly what those supplies are for, and what happened to the victim. The next few hours were a blur of coordinated action. The detective made calls, her voice sharper, more authoritative than before. My own experience in high-stakes situations kicked in, my mind clear, focused. We had a target, the corporate executive, the orchestrator of this elaborate, deadly charade. We found the corporate executive in their opulent office, the city skyline a glittering backdrop through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The air was thick with the scent of expensive polish and a faint, metallic tang from the powerful air conditioning. The executive, a figure of practiced charm and ruthless ambition, sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a forced smile playing on their lips. "Detective," the executive began, their voice smooth as silk. "And Jamal, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" The detective stepped forward, her stance firm. "We're here about the deceased on your construction site. Irregularities, nonsense, everything is above board. A tragic accident, nothing more." "Is it?" I interjected, stepping beside the detective. "Because we have evidence of illegal waste disposal on the site. Evidence that the victim was likely trying to expose. And evidence that someone has been using my name to purchase supplies to facilitate a cover-up items like irrigation systems and electric fences, presumably to create a false wildlife habitat over a contaminated area." I watched the executive's face, searching for a crack in the facade. The color drained from their cheeks, their eyes darting to the detective, then back to me. "This is outrageous. Slander. I'll have your badge, detective. And Jamal, your career will be over. I have powerful connections. You're making a grave mistake." Their voice, though still attempting to project authority, had a slight tremor. "Your connections won't help you when we uncover the truth about the victim's death," the detective stated, her voice cutting through the executive's bluster. "We have the receipt, Jamal's name. and the timeline. We also have new information from an anonymous tip about the land's original condition, information that corroborates Jamal's theory about the waste disposal. The victim was about to go public, weren't they? The executive's composure finally shattered. They slammed a fist on the desk, the sound sharp in the quiet room. They were going to ruin everything. Years of work, gone. The company, my reputation. All for some misguided sense of environmental purity. Their breathing became ragged, their eyes wild. It was an accident. They found the secondary disposal site. They started asking too many questions. I confronted them. There was a struggle. They fell. It wasn't meant to happen. The truth, ugly and raw, hung in the air, heavy as lead. The corporate executive had been cutting corners for years, illegally dumping toxic waste on the site designated for the new park. The elaborate purchases in my name, the staged accident, the buried soil reports, all a desperate attempt to bury the truth and shift the blame. The metallic fear that had coated my tongue earlier now felt like bile. We had it, all of it. The air in the interrogation room had become a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, smelling of stale coffee and something acrid, like burnt plastic. The corporate executive, once so impeccably composed, now slumped across the table, his face a marbled landscape of disbelief and rage. The detective stood over him, calm as a lake at dawn, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the executive's eyes. "I killed them," I stated, my voice rough, tasting like ash. The words were not a question. They were the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle, the jagged edge that fit into the gaping wound of the victim's death. The executive's head snapped up, eyes wild, but the defiance was brittle, already cracking. He opened his mouth, a guttural sound escaping, but no words formed. His denial was a whimper, a dying gasp before the truth consumed him. Outside, the first distant wail of sirens began to bleed into the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. They grew closer, a rising crescendo that promised chaos. The detective gave a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitable. The executive's hands, which had been clutching the edge of the table, now trembled violently, the grip tight. He looked at me, then at the detective, a terrible understanding dawning in his eyes, like a dark sunrise. He knew, we all did. Justice, slow and grinding, had finally caught him in its gears. The door burst open, and uniformed officers flooded the room, their movements precise, professional. The executive was cuffed, his protest swallowed by the sudden influx of noise and activity. As he was led away, his gaze snagged on mine, a venomous, wordless promise hanging between us. I felt a cold, not tighten in my stomach. The relief of the truth being out was immediate, but the cost, I knew, was only just beginning to accumulate. Days later, the construction site was a hive of activity, but not the kind I was used to. Media vans lined the road, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like metallic sunflowers. Reporters with microphones clustered at the temporary fencing, shouting questions at anyone who dared to venture near. My phone hadn't stopped vibrating for 48 hours straight, a constant, irritating thrum against my hip. The smell of freshly turned earth now carried a faint, unsettling undertone, the lingering ghost of the toxic waste that had been unearthed. I was summoned to the main office, the polished floors reflecting the harsh overhead lights in a way that made everything feel sterile and unforgiving. The head of HR, a woman with a perpetually pursed mouth, sat opposite me, her gaze dissecting like a surgeon's. The general manager, a man whose smile usually felt like a handshake, now wore a grimace that pinched his features into something unrecognizable. "Jamal," the general manager began, his voice tight, "we appreciate my dedication, but this has caused a significant public relations crisis for the company. Our stock has taken a hit. Investors are calling." He gestured vaguely at the windows, as if the angry mob of reporters outside was personally my fault. I felt a surge of heat, a familiar tension building behind my eyes. I had done the right thing. That was all that mattered. "I found a body, sir," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "And then I found out why. Someone died because of what was happening on our site. I couldn't just bury that with them." The HR manager sniffed, a dismissive sound that grated on my nerves. There are protocols, Jamal, ways to handle these things internally. I went rogue. I undermined the company. The accusation hung heavy, smelling of betrayal and corporate self-preservation. I looked at their faces, seeing only concern for profit, not for human life, not for the park that would never be. I felt a brief, unsettling doubt. Had I gone too far? Had I jeopardized my own future for a truth no one wanted to hear? Later that afternoon, needing to clear my head, I found myself driving to the feed store. Supplies ordered in your name. You're not farming. The address had come through on a cryptic email, a delivery confirmation for items I'd never ordered. The dusty lot smelled of hay and something vaguely animal, a warm, earthy scent that was a welcome change from the sterile office air. Inside, sacks of grain towered like ancient monuments, their rough burlap textures catching the light. Jamal, a young man with a friendly face and a faded apron, emerged from behind a counter piled with seed packets. My order's ready. Pretty big one. Never had a Jamal order this much before. He chuckled, oblivious. I stared at the invoice he handed me. 50 pounds of chicken feed, a bale of alfalfa, and a small, expensive-looking water pump. My name, printed clearly, stared back at me. I wasn't farming. I didn't even have a garden. The incongruity was jarring, a small, unsettling ripple in the already turbulent waters of my life. It felt like another loose thread, something deliberately placed to confuse or perhaps to mark. The news cycles were relentless. Every channel, every paper, carried the story of the corporate executive's arrest, the toxic waste dumping, the victim's desperate attempt to expose it, and the subsequent murder. The details of the cover-up were laid bare, sickening in their calculated cruelty. I saw my own face, blurred and pixelated, in the background of some of the reports, a silent witness. The public outcry was deafening, a collective roar of outrage that echoed my own. The victim's family held a press conference, their grief palpable, their quiet dignity a stark contrast to the executive's earlier bluster. I watched, a lump forming in my throat, knowing that while justice might be grinding forward, their pain would linger. The legal system, slow and methodical, began its work. Lawyers were appointed, evidence was catalogued, and the long road to trial stretched ahead. My own company issued a carefully worded statement, expressing shock and promising full cooperation with authorities, conveniently omitting any mention of my role in bringing the truth to light. My job status remained in limbo, a dangling participle in the sentence of my career. The cost was real, concrete. The stability I had craved, the quiet life I had hoped for, shattered by the truth. But as I watched the news report about the cleanup crews beginning to clear the contaminated site, the sun glinting off their protective gear, I knew I had made the right choice. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the first, hardest battle had been won. The detective, a quiet observer until then, simply slid a thick file across the table, its cover emblazoned with a company logo. My part was done. I felt an odd mix of exhaustion and a strange, hollow satisfaction. The truth had a bitter taste, but at least it was out. Weeks later, the construction site hummed with a different kind of energy. The yellow tape was gone. The excavation pit no longer a gaping wound, but a foundation actively being filled. I walked the perimeter, my boots crunching on fresh gravel. The scent of damp earth and new lumber a welcome change from the metallic tang of fear that had coated my tongue for so long. The old crew, the ones who'd been there when we found the body, moved with a subdued efficiency. We hadn't held a formal memorial, not exactly. Instead, the foreman had simply called for a moment of silence one morning, the heavy machinery falling still. The only sound the distant shriek of gulls overhead. It felt more fitting. A quiet acknowledgement among men who understood the fragility of life on a job site. My hands, once calloused from the rifle grip, now felt the familiar rough grain of a 2x4 as I checked a temporary support beam. The rhythm of the site, the clang of steel, the shouts of the riggers, it was a balm. But beneath the surface, a tremor of unease still vibrated. The corporate executive was facing serious charges, and the company, though outwardly projecting an image of cooperation, was a wounded beast. I'd given my statements, countless times, reliving the discovery, detailing the subtle inconsistencies, the small forensic clues that had guided me. It felt like I was still on patrol, scanning for threats, only now the enemies wore suits and hid behind spreadsheets. A promotion had been offered. A significant jump, a role in corporate oversight, specifically in safety and compliance. The regional manager, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, had painted a glowing picture of my future. My unique perspective, Jamal, he'd said, my attention to detail, invaluable. He meant my military background, my training in observation and threat assessment, skills I'd spent years trying to shed in civilian life. But now, it seemed, those very skills had become my currency. I'd nodded, thanked him, promised to think about it. The offer sat heavy in my gut, a mixture of validation and a deep suspicion. Was it a genuine recognition, or a move to keep me close to control the narrative? The decision had gnawed at me. I'd walked away from the military seeking piece, but I'd found something else entirely. A different kind of battlefield, where the lines were blurry and the weapons were deception and greed. I hadn't wanted to be a hero. I just wanted to build. But the truth was, I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. The ice had flooded my veins too many times to simply forget. A week later, I found myself pulling up to the local feed store. Supplies ordered in your name, you're not farming. The lot was dusty, smelling of hay and damp earth, a stark contrast to the gleaming glass towers of downtown. I parked my beat-up truck next to a much larger, rust-speckled flatbed. My order was ready, stacked neatly on a pallet. Bags of concrete mix, stack of treated lumber. Not for a farm, not for a corporate high-rise. This was for a community project I'd volunteered for, turning a derelict lot into a small urban garden and gathering space. A tangible act of building, of creating something positive from the ground up with my own hands. The manager of the feed store, a burly man with a permanent squint, helped me load the bags onto my truck. Big plans, Jamal. He grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. I just nodded, a small smile playing on my lips. Something like that. This was different. No hidden agendas, no corporate lies. Just honest work, a direct impact. I felt the weight of the bags, the rough texture of the paper, the solid thud as they landed in the bed of my truck. It was a good weight. I hadn't accepted the promotion. I told the regional manager I needed to step back, to reevaluate. He hadn't been happy, his smile freezing at the edges, but the choice was mine. I still worked at the company, but in a different capacity, a project supervisor on smaller, independent builds with more autonomy. It was a calculated risk, a deliberate step away from the corporate snake pit. I was using my skills, yes, but on my terms. I hadn't lost my edge, I'd simply sharpened it in a new direction. My military past, the discipline, the unwavering focus, the ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was a foundation. I carried the memory of the victim, a silent sentinel against complacency. The metallic fear that had once coated my tongue was now replaced by the clean, earthy taste of possibility. I wasn't just building structures anymore. I was building a future, one concrete block at a time, where honesty held more weight than any corporate secret. And for the first time in a long time, the path ahead felt clear, even if it was still a little dusty.